Hello, and welcome to the eOrganic webinar on transitioning organic dairy cows off and on pasture. My name is Deb Haliba, and I work at the University of Vermont Extension as eOrganic's Dairy Team Coordinator. eOrganic is an online community of more than 600 ag service providers and farmers who are providing science, experience, and regulation-based certified organic information on the web. Together we publish articles, videos, and other content at eextension.org. This webinar is part of an ongoing series focused on the access to pasture rule and grazing management strategies. Our first webinar, offered in March, featured Carrie Smith of the USDA National Organic Program describing the rule, and we've offered several webinars over the grazing season since that time. You can see more information about these webinars, find the recording of today's webinar, and view our other content on our website at www.eextension.org/organic_production. Before we get started, I wanted to give a quick rundown of today's webinar. Rick will give his presentation for about 45 minutes. Then we will ask you to respond to 3 quick questions that will pop up on your screen. And then we'll hold a question and answer session with Rick for about 30 minutes. So if at any time you have a question, you can simply type it into the question box on your screen and hit return. If you can't see the question box, click the small plus sign next to the word question on your control panel to open it up. And we'll answer as many questions as we have time for. Finally, we ask that you respond to an email you will receive following the webinar to complete a follow-up survey. Okay, I would now like to introduce our speaker today. Rick Kersbergen is an extension professor at the University of Maine Cooperative Extension. Rick has been conducting research and extension programs related to sustainable dairy and forage management systems since 1987. He is currently involved with several multi-state applied research projects on cover crops, organic grains production, and forage and nutrient management. Rick is past chair of the Northeast Pasture Consortium and manages the Northeast Grazing Guide, a regional website that provides research results, events, and other information on management-intensive grazing. Rick, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Deb. I appreciate you inviting me to do this, and hopefully everyone can get some good information about this seminar and learn some new things, and hopefully we can have a good discussion at the end. I do want to start by saying that a lot of my comments may be directed more towards conditions here in the Northeast, and maybe towards the end we can talk a little bit more about some areas of the country that I may not address and may not have some good information, and maybe others can chime in as well about that. But I am going to talk about transitioning cows on and off pasture, but I'm also going to talk a lot about how I think organic dairy farms should prepare for getting themselves ready for winter season, and some of the considerations you may want to take to try and improve profitability on your farms during the non-grazing season. One of the things I do want to mention, I'm going to try and go back one if I can and list some resources, and I put these 2 up here because this is part of a 4-book series that Ed Rayburn put together as an editor that are being offered by NRAS, which is a natural resource agricultural and engineering service out of Cornell. And there's a whole series on pasture-based livestock production, and these are just 2 books that are available. And one of the things I like about these is that there's a session on marketing, and there's also a session on animal production. And this whole series is actually on sale now through NRAS, and so if people have interest in these books, you should visit the NRAS site, and you can potentially get these at a fairly cheap cost, and they're very good resources. The animal production one's especially good. So one of the things I want to talk about is the fact that we can extend the grazing season on both ends. And obviously it's too late for this season, but when we start planning and thinking about next season, maybe we can think about how we can extend that, because grazing is the cheapest way to produce milk and meat on organic dairy farms. And traditionally in the Northeast, we look at our grazing season in Maine from about May 10th to October 15th. And if we look at some various tools that we'll talk about, we can probably extend that, maybe go from April 15th to November 15th, a 40% increase in grazing days, which would potentially improve profitability on a lot of farms. Some of the tools we can use to do that include growing winter and spring grains. We can stockpile some forages. And then in the Northeast, we've had some interest in trying to use some improved tall fescue varieties to extend the grazing season into the fall and get some better quality material going into the fall. One of the research projects that Deb mentioned that we worked on here in Maine is looking at winter grain production, and also looking at spring grains to try and use some of that to both increase potential concentrate production in the Northeast for organic dairy farmers, but also look at how we might be able to utilize those in a pasture situation. We can look at winter grains and grazing them in the fall and in the spring. Obviously, they put on lots of growth during what we consider our non-growing season, which would be from October and November, and then again in April and May. And we can graze those and then potentially also leave those and harvest a forage crop that can be stored for later on in the season. Spring-grown grains provide some decent grazing for us in the summer if we do have a summer slump, if those are sown early in the spring in the Northeast. And then we also need to think about how well we manage manure. I know there's been some seminars on manure management as well as some publications online on the eOrganic website. But small grains can be an important part of manure usage and manure spreading in the fall. It gives us a place to spread some manure where we're going to minimize some detrimental environmental impacts. Another one that it's generated a lot of interest recently, and Faye Benson from Cornell has done a fair amount of work, is looking at Brassicas as a forage crop to extend the grazing season. These are very palatable crops. They do very well seeded in the midsummer season here in the Northeast. Very palatable. We've looked at clear seeding them, but we find that there's very little fiber associated with these crops, and so we often recommend that you use a small grain as well to increase the fiber, so when cows are consuming this material, they have somewhat of a balanced diet in terms of their fiber needs. There's lots of species you can choose from, lots of varieties, and you should probably look for crops that are associated well for your growing season and growing area. But they are great crops to use. They're highly digestible, high crude protein. There has been some interest in trying to mechanically harvest these, but most of them are going to be used for forage crops. One of the issues is the lack of fiber, and again, you need to either seed those with a grain crop and or limit feed that during the pasture season. So you just give them small amounts at a time and make sure that you feed them some high fiber material before they go out on pasture in those Brassicas. This is a picture that Steve Herbert from University of Massachusetts took on December. Actually, it was on Christmas, 25th of December, and it's a bunch of Brassicas that he was doing some work on. And obviously, you can see there's a fair amount of dry matter there, of forage available late in the season, way past our normal grazing season here in the Northeast. And if you look at some of the tonnage yields that he was pulling off from those, you can see that significant amount of fresh forage yield potentially available late in that season. And so these were harvested, these yields were harvested in December from crops that were sown in the red bars, either from June, and then harvested in September or July, harvested September 20th, and August 13th, harvested November 5th. And so obviously some significant yields of potentially highly digestible material that we can use to extend the grazing season for dairy cows. So what's happening now, and depending on where you are, here in Maine, it's relatively cold. We've had some snow, but not very much on the ground, just very cold weather. And so most farmers have pulled their cows off of pasture or are slowly pulling them off of pasture. We need to think about how and what we're going to feed in terms of stored feed in the barn. Some of the other things you want to think about as you start bringing cows into barns, especially to feed them and they may be in there longer, is make sure that you've got adequate ventilation in your barns. Make sure that you clean barn fans, make them more efficient. Make sure that you control the temperature to some extent. So I always try and tell people to keep their barns as cold as possible and keep them from freezing, but keep them as cold as possible. It's also a good time to think about your vaccination schedules and look at all sorts of herd health records. It's time to make sure you're well conditioned for the winter season. You also want to think about doing body condition scoring on your animals, see what kind of body condition they have coming off of pasture in the fall, and see whether you need to increase their energy content in their rations to try and improve that. You also need to think about doing an inventory of stored feed resources, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. And not only how much feed do you have, but how do you segregate and how do you think about quality, and when do you feed the quality feeds versus the lower potential quality feeds that you have in storage. And the other thing, a lot of people are out wintering their cows, and a lot of organic dairy farmers are feeding their cows outside during the winter, and you want to think about where you're going to be doing that, where you're going to do that when you have some wetter, muddier, snowier conditions, and develop a plan for how you're going to feed them outside if you're going to do that. So those are some considerations you want to think about going into the fall season. So what's happening to the grass resources out there right now? Well, we have less light, less sunlight, both intensity and duration. So with less light, obviously the plants are photosynthesizing less, or actually have almost completely shut down. And obviously there's lower sugar content, so there's less digestible energy in the pasture resources we have right now. The temperatures are declining, which potentially results in lower lignin content in the grasses, which would decrease the amount of fiber in the cow's diet. So something we need to think about when we're supplementing them and thinking about improving the amount of digestible fiber and make sure that we have a healthy rumen in those cows. So when we make changes in rations, we always want to make changes slowly. So as you're taking cows off pasture, you want to make that over a period of time. And you got to think about what you're doing when you change those feed sources. You're changing a whole community of rumen microorganisms. And you need to do that over time because obviously they're not going to change quickly. And you need to think about how you're going to feed increased amounts of concentrate, because most people will probably be feeding higher levels of grain in the winter than they do in the summer. At least that's the case in Maine. When cows are on pasture, they have probably the highest quality forage, and you need probably the least amount of concentrate. Well, when you come back into the barn, we're probably going into a situation where the forage quality and overall is probably declined from what it was on pasture, and we need to feed more concentrate, and that could be energy and protein. And you need to change that population of bacteria to one that can handle more of that concentrate and handle a different type of feed stuff going in. So you need to know the quality of the stored feed you have, and knowing that's important. We're going to talk about sampling and quality analysis in a few minutes, but it's important to know what you've got. I also recommend that people use buffers during this transition period, so sodium bicarb or another type of buffer would be great, just to minimize the changes in acidity produced by increasing feeding concentrate. I also think it's important to evaluate your mineral and vitamin supplementation at this point, changing it over from a summer ration to a winter one, where you're probably going to increase the amount of mineral and vitamin supplementation that you're giving your cows. And especially look at vitamin A supplementation, especially since we have a lot less sunlight during the day, and cows are inside a little bit more than they were when they were out on pasture most of the day. So making a forage inventory is key, and I think this is probably one of the most important things people should do going into the fall. And if you see this picture here, you'll see there's bales with writing on the sides. And it's important to keep track of especially if you're doing silage packages like this, where those bales came from, what the quality was when it was harvested, so you can prioritize your feed resources. And you need to think about what cows and what animals in your herd should get the best quality feed. And really you want to think about that in terms of trying to improve their health as well as improve the bottom line in terms of the amount of milk production that they're going to get. So I always look to try and find the highest quality feed to feed to my cows that are transitioning, and fresh cows, those are going to be in peak milk production. And it's been a standard rule that you try and produce your best quality forages for those animals. And the higher peak milk production they have early in lactation, the greater their milk production is going to be throughout the whole lactation. You may need to allocate resources based on when your animals are freshening. So if you have a herd of cows that's spring freshening, you want to try and save your highest quality feed for spring. There's been a push towards trying to get more fall milk production, so a lot of people are trying to make sure that their best quality forages are being fed now so they can get peak milk production now. You also need to make sure you have high quality feed for young replacement animals, especially those animals that are just being weaned. It's a good time to think about how you're going to handle those animals and how you're going to provide them with top quality feed as they're coming off of being fed whole milk and onto solid food, and trying to develop that rumen as they get older. And then also, if you're putting cows outside and out wintering them, think about how you're going to try and get some of that best quality feed to some of those animals during the harshest weather conditions. and making sure that they're going to have enough energy, especially if they're going to be outside in cold, wet, windy, snowy weather. You need to make sure you're going to be able to provide them decent quality forages. So forage testing is a key part of that. And this is a picture of a Penn State forage sampler. And I recommend that people use this type of sampling method to sample bales of hay or bales of silage, and use this to sample a number of bales throughout a lot. And obviously if you have your bales and lots marked, you can know where they are, how they're stored, and take good samples. And you want to take a composite sample of a number of different bales. And this basically just drills through the bale. You disengage it from the drill, and you can use a power drill or this hand bit if you want to. The power drills, the batteries go dead pretty quick when you're trying to go through some really heavy, dense baleage, but the hand bit works extremely well as long as you're strong enough to push it through. And then you use that wooden poker to poke out the sample into your sample bags and take a composite sample. So whether you're doing round bale silage, round bale hay, dry hay in square bales, or bunker silos, it's important to get a good representative sample. One of the things I also like people to do, especially going in the fall, is have some idea how much those large bale packages weigh, whether it's silage or round bales of hay in the field. How much do they weigh? You know, obviously you have some idea when you buy a baler what's its capacity in terms of size, but it really is important to know exactly how much you're feeding your animals. You may be feeding them 2 bales a day, but it'd be nice to know if you're feeding them, 1,600 pounds a day, or are you feeding them 2,100 pounds a day of feed? So it's important to understand that. And at University of Maine, we use truck scales. We weigh some of the round bales every once in a while, and basically we put them on a trailer and drive the trailer onto some truck scales to get some idea of what those bales weigh. And it's a good way to begin your ration formulation as you're going through the season. So one of my pet peeves was that previous picture where we saw those round bales sitting out in the field. And if I have a plug to put in today, it's to say, maybe you should think about trying to find places to store round bales under cover rather than leaving them in the field and going to get them when you need them. And this is some work from Michigan State University that looked at the amount of forage that's lost from a bale in terms of inches of spoilage on the percent of forage lost in the bale. And so I have a lot of producers that remind me that, it's so much easier and time-consuming or easier to leave those bales out in the field and go get them later when you need them. But if you've got 4 or 5 inches of spoilage on those bales, you're losing 25 to 30% of that bale. And here in Maine, where it's wet and cold and we get a lot of water soaking up from the ground as well as water coming in, I often find bales with more than 6 or 7 inches of spoilage around the entire bale, and you're losing a considerable amount. And if you wanted to put that into dollars and cents, and this is really based on hay at $60 a ton, and obviously organic hay, especially if it's quality hay, is worth quite a bit more than that. But again, if you have that 4 to 5 inches, you're losing $8 to $10 a bale of hay, or $10 per bale of hay, by leaving those bales out in the field. So a pole barn or some sort of structure where you're going to store those bales under cover will quickly pay for itself, especially with quality forage. It's probably worth $180 to $200 a ton if it's really good quality feed. So no matter what kind of forage you have, and whatever forage package you have, it's important to try and get good representative samples. And so if it's square bales, you're going to be drilling through those to the end of the bale. If you're doing round bale silages, you want to drill through those from the long side and make sure you tape up or seal those packages back up again so you don't get spoilage. And yes, that bale on the bottom looks kind of funny, and that's a bale of round bale corn silage. And we actually have some producers that round bale their corn silage. I'm not sure I'd recommend that, but some producers think it's a relatively easy way to put up corn silage. So when you're looking at forage sampling, obviously we talked about the Penn State Forage Sampler is a good tool. Grab samples just don't seem to give us a good representative sample, and being able to bore through a bunch of bales and collect a sample that's random and a composite of a number of bales will probably give you the best analysis for what you want to do in terms of ration formulation. For silages, if you're in a bunker silo, it's a little bit different. You need to go through and collect samples off the face of that bunk. I like to take those samples as the producer is potentially feeding out that day, so you can get some fresh samples off the face. One of the other ways to do this is to actually wait till someone has taken all their feed off the face of the bunker and put it in a mixer wagon, have them mix it up, and then take a sample coming out of the mixer wagon. That makes it a little bit easier, and you're actually sampling what gets fed to that cow's day. So when we look at analysis for feeds and you're trying to determine quality, there are two methods most people use for determining quality. One would be what we call wet chemistry analysis, and basically that's the actual measurement of the fiber constituents, whether it's acid detergent fiber, neutral detergent fiber. And then basically it's what we call the net energy system, and we use those fiber components and the crude protein to determine the net energy of those feeds, and we use that in ration formulation. Obviously it's a little bit more expensive because it is actual wet chemistry and it takes some time in the lab, so it's relatively expensive compared to the next analysis that I'm going to talk about. But when you do wet chemistry, you can also potentially take some of those samples and do digestibility, where we take some of the feed and incubate that with rumen fluid for a number of hours, whether it's 24, 36, or 48 hours. And we can figure out how digestible that feed is by using that rumen fluid and measuring how much does get digested by the microbes in that rumen fluid. And if you're feeding crops that contain the brown midrib gene, like brown midrib sorghum Sudan grass or brown midrib corn, you need to do those digestibility measurements to actually get a good ration formulation and understand how well the cows are using those feeds. More often than not, people have switched to a near infrared reflectance type of analysis. It's a much quicker analysis. It's basically done through a sophisticated analytical technique using spectral analysis to determine the nutrient composition of the feed. It's been used for a number of years now. It's obviously well documented and relatively accurate. It's based on a number of calibrations, and so when you send a sample in, a corn silage sample, for example, it's calibrated against other corn silage samples that were done through wet chemistry to make sure that it's correct. So if you're doing NIR, we recommend that you make sure that you send those samples to a regional lab rather than a lab that may be across the country, because they're going to use calibrations for feeds that are similar to your area. Most people will use NIR for their analysis. It is quicker, it is cheaper, and it does provide a high level of accuracy in terms of ration formulation. So what is good feed? So when we're trying to take these cows off of pasture and put them on high quality feed, we look at some of the measurements coming off a forage test, but we also need to think about some other things. We always look at crude protein as a measure of quality. How good is that haylage? Well, you measure it by crude protein, but you also need to look at the fiber components, because the fiber components are the ones that are going to determine how much digestible energy is in that feed. And usually for lactating dairy cows, we look at that in terms of net energy of lactation. We want to make sure that those feeds are stored correctly, make sure we're not feeding moldy feed that's been heated up. So we want to make sure it's been stored correctly. And really what we look at is forages that have a high intake potential. And there have been a number of different webinars. I think Karen Hoffman did a webinar on maximizing dry matter intake of forages, and I think she specifically talked about pasture, but it's very important as well as you transition to stored feeds that you also have forages that have high intake potential, and you try and maximize that intake. It's important, one, from the fact that most organic dairy farmers now will need to start measuring dry matter intake both on pasture and in the non-grazing season when they're in the barn. And also from a productivity standpoint, because as dairy farmers we should be always thinking about how do we maximize dry matter intake, because dry matter intake really does impact the volume and quality of milk production, and especially when we look at maximizing dry matter intake of forages. And we also look at trying to calculate these dry matter intakes as a potential tool to figure out, make sure we meet our 30% dry matter intake from pasture during the grazing season. So both inspectors and dairy farmers should be paying attention to what actually gets fed, measuring it, and understanding that dry matter intake maximizing dry matter intake is probably one of the most important factors in feeding a well-managed dairy herd. So if we look at the impact of forage quality on dry matter intake, and you look at NDF, which is stands for neutral detergent fiber. It's one of the fiber measurements that does get measured in wet chemistry analysis and predicted in the NIR analysis. You can see that on this graph, if you have poor quality or 85% NDF, which is really poor quality, it really reduces the dry matter intake of an animal. Basically, the animal is filling up with bulk fibrous feeds, and the physical nature and slow passage of those fibrous feeds through the animal's rumen limits how much she can take in, versus the dry matter intake of excellent forage, or 40% NDF. We can really improve the dry matter intake. So the difference between a 17 kilograms per day dry matter intake and 21 kilograms per day dry matter intake would be a huge situational change for the animal in terms of the amount of milk she'll be able to produce simply on the forage alone. And if you're trying to balance a ration with forages that have low intake potential, it is going to force you to feed more concentrate for the same level of milk production. So having high quality forage is both healthier as well as more economical and more important on your bottom line. It's also important to think about how you feed some of these feeds, and so we always talk about different rations. There's the ration that the nutritionist makes for you if you have a hired nutritionist, or the grain salesman would formulate for you. There's a ration that gets fed to the cow, and then there's the ration that actually gets eaten by the cow, and all three of those may be different. So it's important to think about that in terms of how you present that feed to the animals. How much of it's going to get wasted, how much do they utilize, how much do they sort. So it's important to think about that and look exactly in terms of trying to figure out what are cows eating and what's getting utilized for milk production, what's getting wasted, and how accurate is that ration that the nutritionist or consultant might make for you in terms of what actually gets consumed by the cow to make milk. So here are some analysis of some different feeds, and this is actually from an organic research trial that we did at the University of Maine, where we harvested a number of different feeds and tried to evaluate feeding strategies for organic dairy animals. But this was a field of timothy, perennial ryegrass, and alfalfa that we seeded in 2005. So this was a new seeding. And for some management factors, we didn't harvest this till the second week of June in 2006. And so if we looked at the figures in red, you'll see that the crude protein is 11.1. The ADF, which is a measure we usually use for indicating the energy content, it's the number we use predominantly to determine the net energy lactation, is 42.7. And the NDF is 65.5. So if we go back to that other chart and remember what has high or low intake potential, you'll see that this is relatively low intake potential. The other figure that's in red there is non-fiber carbohydrates, which is a measure of basically the cell contents, the plant cell contents, and that's 100% digestible. So we'd like to see that number higher when we look at forage analysis. But this field was one that we had high hopes for. It was a new seeded field, a fairly high level of alfalfa in it, but obviously it didn't get harvested until the second week of June, and at that point most of the quality had declined rapidly. So in the Northeast, we always look at trying to get the first quality harvest done the last week of May. And just that difference of 2 to 3 weeks really reduces the quality. So the following year, we tried to step up our management a little bit. And this is the exact same field, but it was harvested the last week of May. And if we look at the forage quality here, we see we've improved forage quality considerably. Our crude protein is 16.8. The ADF is 34.6, and the NDF is 53.3. And really that improves the quality and the intake potential of this feed dramatically. Same field, and then at this point, the second year, we probably have less alfalfa than we did the first year. But just by improving the harvest date, we were able to produce a much more digestible and higher energy quality feed. And if we look at another feed analysis, and this is a third cutting of that same field, you can see that we've really improved the quality just by the more timely harvest on the third quality. And feed that's harvested second and third cutting, especially here in the Northeast, tends to decline in quality less rapidly than that first cutting. So we have some more flexibility in how we manage the forages. But if I was looking for an ideal feed to feed some cows, this is a round bale silage, by the way. This is an analysis that I would love to have on my dairy farm if I was running it. We see an ADF value of 27.7, crude protein of 23.2, an NDF of 37.7, and a non-fibrable carbohydrate level of 29.0. This would be an ideal forage to utilize for those high-producing, fresh, transitional dairy cows where you're trying to maximize their dry matter intake and minimize metabolic problems throughout the rest of the lactation. This would be a great feed. So one of the things we want to look at is not only taking those quality feeds, but how do we manage those feeds and realize that, how do we maximize that dry matter intake. So for each pound additional dry matter intake, we usually yield about 2 pounds more milk, and so it's really important to maximize that. We need to take a look at what makes some of the difference. And one of the things that we also need to consider when we're doing ration formulation or looking at these stored feeds and feeding more grain during the winter is the price of organic feed grain. And Bob Parsons put this together, and I think it was probably a slide that he used on an earlier webinar about the cost of producing organic milk. But obviously, if you're an organic dairy farmer, you know that these prices for organic grains has gone up considerably since 2005. And it's a key part of trying to maintain profitability on your farm is minimizing the amount of organic purchased grain you would have to purchase and feed your dairy cows. So just looking at and trying to improve crude protein content in your forages and what it can do for your bottom line, if you were able to increase your crude protein in your forages from 14 to 17%, and you are buying organic protein at $1.10 a pound, which is probably a little high at this point for what the price of organic soybean meal is. If you harvested 100 acres of grass and it was 4 tons to the acre yield, that would be a $24,000 difference just in protein savings that you could save. So improving forage quality is key to profitability. So how do you make decisions about feeding? And one of the things I like to do is not say that you're going to supplement your cows, but you're going to complement your cows' diets with grain, with quality forages. So you need to make sure you understand how forages are digested and the grains are digested. I love this picture that I'm going to show that Larry Satter produced a number of years ago because it really helps understand what I call the energy and protein balance that goes on in a rumen, and it really important factor in determining how to feed dairy cows. And so if you look at this, and I'm going to use my pointer here, look at this balance here. When we feed protein to a dairy cow, there's a number of different components of protein: soluble, degradable, undegradable, bypass. And really what we're trying to do is to maximize the amount of microbial protein that gets produced in this rumen. And that's what this line is, this bacterial protein. And really you can look at it in terms of a balance. And we feed protein, but that protein is usually broken down by bacteria in the rumen, and then it is fermented with what we consider available energy and formed into bacterial protein. And so we need to make sure that the protein and the energy is in a balanced situation. That's what this signifies right here. If we have too much protein, we lose a lot through the liver. It's excreted in the urine. If we have too much energy and not enough protein, we ended up producing a lot of what we call a propionic-based fermentation, and we get a lot of back fat produced instead of milk fat for the dairy cow. So what we want to do is consider how the protein gets broken down, how quickly it's broken down, and how much fermentable energy is available. And it really is a balancing situation. And dairy farmers can use this balancing situation to maximize the amount of bacterial protein. And they can really follow that by looking at milk urea nitrogen concentrations, as well as manure and urine as well. So if your cows are producing a lot of urine, potentially they're overfeeding protein. If your milk urea nitrogen levels are high or MUN levels are high, you're probably feeding too much protein and not enough fermentable energy. If you look at the manure and see that there's a fair amount of grain content in that manure, you may be overfeeding grain and not enough protein, or vice versa. So you need to look at that and use those monitoring tools. I have a fairly fine screen that I use and take to farms, and I throw some manure in and take a hose and wash it down. And sometimes farmers are flabbergasted by the amount of grain that's sitting left over on that screen after you wash some of the manure through it with some water. And it's really a telltale sign of the fact that cows potentially are not utilizing all that you feed them. So excess proteins cost you not only in the fact that you're buying that protein and you ended up in the gutter cleaner or out in the manure pile, but the fact that it takes an animal some energy to get rid of all that nitrogen. So you really need to use some monitoring tools to see how well your protein balance is in the feeds that you're feeding them in the barn. The other half of that balancing act is the grain portion, or the energy component, in terms of how quickly that's digested. So if you're feeding a high quality forage that has a fair amount of soluble protein, you're going to need an energy source that's also highly fermentable, and it's going to keep that energy and protein balance in check. And so different grains have different rates of digestion, how you process those grains. If there's some other components of the diet, if the forage has high amounts of sugar, that helps in the energy balance. And that's going to also impact how quickly it's going through the rumen and the digestible energy you're going to derive from that. Now this slide is a little fuzzy, I'm sorry to say, but if you look at the red line, basically what we're looking at is how quickly it's digested in a cow's rumen over about a 24 or 25 hour period. And the red line is relatively slow digestion rate. So corn by itself is relatively slow, and obviously you can impact this a little bit by how finely it's ground. But compare that to the green line, the bright green line, which is wheat. Wheat is almost explosive in a cow's rumen. It's quickly fermented. And that can be a negative as well as a positive, depending on if you have a lot of available protein early on when you feed that. Is going to impact that as well. The other three lines are different types of barley and different types of processing and different barley cultivars. And obviously barley is more rapidly digestible and fermented than the corn is, but that can vary based on how you process it as well, whether it's ground, whether it's rolled, whether it's tempered. So when you're feeding these concentrates, you need to think about not only how much do you feed, but how do you feed it, what kind of forages are you feeding it with, what kind of proteins are you feeding with? Are they soluble proteins? Are they quickly degraded? How is the grain processed? Is it finely ground? Is it coarsely ground? Is it crimped? Is it rolled? How often you feed the grain? That can impact how quickly and how well that energy and protein balance occurs in the rumen. Know your grains and specific characteristics, and watch your cows and watch the manure. That's an important component of it. Watch what they're doing, monitor those blood or milk urea nitrogen levels, and watch the manure as well. It's an important monitoring tool. Test those grains, and here's just some data from some barley samples that we did in terms of different values for whole barley. They range anywhere from 7.2 to 21.4. Obviously, if you look at a book value, it's going to be around 10 to 12% is a book value, but actually in the field we potentially have quite a variation. ADF values range from 5.6 to 21.8, a huge variety, and starch levels also. So really, grain testing is important as forage testing is, especially if you're buying large lots of a certain type of grain. And then if you're also buying grain, looking at the test weight of grain, as the test weight increases, the digestible energy of that grain improves. So if you're buying organic barley and you have options to choose in terms of test weights, always go for the heavier test weight. That's a key for almost all small grains. The heavier test weight, the higher digestible energy. So we've done a fair amount of research at the University of Maine, and we've looked at a 3-year series of feeding trials that we did, looking at a combination of different forages, looking at trying to compare corn silage-based diets to perennial forage-based diets for organic dairy animals, looking at growing a number of different summer annuals and winter grain forages. And we've done these trials at the University of Maine and as well as University of New Hampshire, where they actually did it on certified organic dairy cows. And we're trying to analyze some of that data right now and try and come up with some sort of tool to help farmers decide, given what they have for resources, soil resources, and weather risk, should they be growing warm season annuals in the Northeast, or should they be growing perennial forages only, and what's going to be the best tool given what they have for land, size, soil resources for the Northeast. And we actually have a paper that's going to be coming out in the Journal of Dairy Science that's looked at some of these feeding trials that a recent PhD graduate from the University of New Hampshire, Sue Marson, is publishing in the Journal of Dairy Science that hopefully will be out relatively soon, that compares some of these diets and the evaluation of what might be the best diets considering organic dairy cows. I think when we look at feeding organic dairy cows in the barn, we're also looking at feeding cows not the same manner we feed conventional dairy cows. I think if we polled most organic dairy farmers, they would say that they feed less grain to organic dairy cows than they do to their conventional cows when they were probably conventional dairy farmers. And some of that is based on economics, and some of that is based on their management system. So we need to rethink how we feed organic dairy cows to make sure we continue a healthy diet for those animals, as well as make it an economical and profitable situation for dairy farmers. So again, I just wanted to put up this resource for the Animal Production Systems book from NRAIS. It's another great resource. There is another fact sheet on the eOrganic website that Karen Hoffman put up with the same title as this webinar has, so there's some information there. And it talks about transitioning cows on and off pasture. I've talked mostly about taking them off pasture and how to get producing quality milk on stored feeds in the barn. But there is a fact sheet up there by Karen as well. So with that, I think we're ready to take some questions and do the poll. Deb?
Great, Rick. Thank you so much. So like Rick said, before we move to our question and answer period, we are going to ask you to complete a very quick poll. So there's 3 questions. Each one will pop up on your screen for about 20 seconds. So here's the first one, and I'll just read it to you. As a result of this webinar, do you understand the importance of forage testing and doing a feed inventory in the fall? So if you could just click on one of those 3 choices, that would be fabulous. And we'll just wait just a couple of seconds here and then move on to our next one. Great. And here comes number 2, which is, will you change the way you feed concentrates to your cows during the non-grazing season? You could answer that. That would be great. There's 3 choices up there. Good. I see responses coming in. Okay. Probably ready to move on to our third question, which is our third and final question. Do you know what resources are available to help you learn more about animals being fed conserved forages? You can just respond there, and then we'll move over to our Q&A session. That would be great. While we're finishing up waiting for folks to fill out that poll, I just want to remind you that this webinar, the recording of this webinar, will be put up on our website. Great, and then this slide shows where you can find those. Okay, so thank you for responding to the polls. Now we're ready for Q&A. And as a reminder, to pose a question, you just find that question box, which is located on the right-hand side of your screen. You just want to type in your question and hit return. And if for some reason that question box is closed, just try to look for the little plus sign next to the word question to open it up. And basically how this will work is I'll be reading the questions out loud to Rick, and he'll answer as many as we have time for. Okay? So, Rick, I already have some questions in the queue, so we'll get started. One was a sort of a clarifying question. You had talked about second and third cutting forages holding quality longer. Was that in the field or in storage?
That's in the field. Obviously, when the feed is, we have day length changes, the quality in the field declines less rapidly for second and third cutting. That really dramatic decrease in quality occurs mostly in first cutting.
Okay, great. And here's a question that says, would mowing and wilting pasture before turning cows in help with higher forage intake?
That's a great question. I think you'll see that you get more complete utilization of some of the feed if you do that. I'm not sure if Karen talked about that in one of her previous webinars, but we find that if you have wilted forages out there, sometimes we see higher intakes, and we also see a more complete utilization. And some of the less desirable plants get consumed when they're wilted versus if you leave them standing, cows may or may not consume them. But in a wilted form, they seem to consume more of them.
Okay, great. This question asks, what stage should the corn bale silage be mowed and baled?
That's a good question. That bale that you saw in the picture was obviously quite green and wet. I would think that you'd want to make sure that you can try and do that when the moisture content of the whole plant is about 25 to 30%. Or I should say the dry matter is about 25 to 30%. So, 75% moisture. So that's going to be when the corn is just transitioning from the milk to the starch stage in the kernel. So I would base it, if you can, on the total plant moisture content or total plant dry matter. And again, that dry matter should be 25 to 30%.
Great, thanks.
Can I clarify that a little bit too?
Sure, of course.
If you're going to do that, one of the issues we've run into is that when you bale that corn silage, you end up getting a fair amount of dirt associated with the corn itself because the fingers of the baler will be usually picking up a fair amount of dirt. And that concerns me a little bit in terms of potential adverse effects in fermentation. We haven't had any problems, but it's one that concerns me, especially if manure was used as a fertility source in that corn crop. So I would be a little concerned about that and maybe cut that corn relatively high so you minimize how much of that dirt would get into the bale during fermentation.
Okay, great. Other questions for Rick? Okay, here we go. What are some resources for learning more about how to monitor my manure visually?
Boy, I don't have much printed. That's something I usually work with farmers on in terms of just, I'm trying to think if there was a website. There was one a number of years ago that actually had some great pictures of different piles of manure freshly out of a cow and measuring height and how far it splattered and things, fun things like that. But I really like taking some manure and putting on a fine screen and gently washing some water through that, because that gives you an idea of trying to see how much grain is actually being utilized by the animal and how much is passing through. And also it gives you an idea of how much of the fibrous material is being digested as well. Gives you a good idea. But you want to see manure that has a minimal amount of grain coming through, and that's probably the biggest monitoring tool that I would recommend people use.
And following up on that, Rick, someone says here, doesn't it make a difference using cold versus warm water when screening manure? I've heard it does due to the starch.
I've always used cold water, so that I don't know. But I mean, what I'm looking for are larger grain particles that are coming through undigested. And so I don't think the water would make all that much difference. And I'm using a very fine screen as well. So I'm not sure. I haven't heard the difference between warm and cold, but I'll have to look that up. That's a good question. I'll have to do more research on that.
Okay. And a follow-up on the corn bale silage. This fellow says, I have a client that has cows sorting the stalks out from the leaves and leaving the stalks. So I guess that's just a comment.
Yeah, I think that could definitely be an issue.
Oh, okay. So you mentioned milk yield response per pound of forage dry matter eaten 2 to 1. What is the general milk yield response for feeding concentrates?
You know, we always look at that. What's the grain to milk ratio? And if you can get 4 pounds of milk for every pound of concentrate you feed, that's probably a good efficiency rating. Most often it's going to be around 3 to 1, but you should try and get, if you can get really high quality forages, you'd be getting about 4 pounds of milk for every pound of grain. And some of that's going to vary really depending on forage quality more than any other factor.
Okay. This person is asking about research related to, resources for gauging optimal concentrate feeding used with stored high grass-based forages, keeping grain as low as possible. Do you know about any research that's been conducted in that area?
I'm not sure if there's any research conducted. What we did for our trials is that we based all our feeding trials on input that we got from producers in Maine. Basically, the Maine organic milk producers helped us design our feeding trials for both Maine and New Hampshire. And they put an artificial limit on the amount of concentrate we could feed. And basically we said, we want to keep our rations 70% forage, 30% concentrate. And I think that's a fairly good ratio given the price of organic concentrates. And really you need to look at your own situation in terms of, one, if you feed more concentrate, are you getting an economic response? And two, if you're feeding more concentrate, is it adversely impacting the health of those animals in terms of are you potentially putting them under more stress to try and produce more milk or not? And that's a question I'm not sure we've been able to answer. But if you look at trying to figure out what the forage to concentrate ratio is in terms of diets, I think a 70% forage, 30% concentrate ration, especially for early lactation cows, is probably what most organic dairy farmers are feeding, or maybe even less.
Okay, just a quick question back to the screening manure issue. What's the screen size that you've been using?
Boy, I wish I knew what the sieve size was. Unfortunately, it's out in my car, and I don't have it with me, but it's a very fine screen. They don't like it when I bring it in the office, so. But it's a very fine screen, something you actually cannot see clearly through that screen, so it's a very fine mesh.
Okay. If you see a kernel of corn coming through in the manure, did the cow get any value from it?
If you wash that kernel and it looks just as it did when it went in the cow, no, they're not. Usually I will take that kernel and squeeze it, see if it's hollow or see if it's solid. You can take a knife and cut it. And if you still see the starch inside that kernel, no, they got no value added at all. Cows are not very good chewers of grain. We really can't feed whole grains to cows. They just don't chew it well enough. Sheep will chew that kernel of corn or that kernel of barley well enough to break it up. But if it's whole and it's gone right through that cow, then they have not derived any energy from that kernel of corn. And that could be corn from corn silage or corn from a grain that just wasn't ground or processed well enough.
Okay. So I'm at a 1-to-1 stocking rate and rotating my pastures, or my paddock, excuse me, and my pasture runs out around September 20. What suggestions might you have to get it out to October 15?
I would think that if you could seed some winter grains in either beginning of August, late July, beginning of August, whether that's an oat crop or a wheat or barley crop as a forage crop, and you potentially can graze those cows quite a bit longer, 2 to 3 weeks longer. And then potentially also look at adding some other crops. I'm not sure where this question came from, but there might be some other crops that would help extend that grazing season.
Yeah.
The other option is stockpiling. Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. What about up in your neck of the woods? What would you do?
Oh, up here we would probably, I would say the winter grains is probably one of the best ones. The Brassicas, we haven't seen too much use of that, although I think it generates a fair amount of tonnage, and I think the Brassicas would be a great season extension crop. And also a crop to potentially look at using to, say, you're going to renovate a field. You can do a Brassica crop late summer, have them graze that in the fall, and then reseed that crop early in the spring, because the animals will graze that crop and there'll be very little weed pressure going into the spring for seeding either a new seeding or a spring grain.
And I'm sorry, I interrupted you when you were talking about stockpiling. Did you want to mention that?
Well, the other option would be to try and stockpile some forage and allow some of your pastures, if you have some extra pastures or maybe pastures or hay fields that were cut for hay once or twice, and let them grow, and use some of that forage later in the season. Let it sit, and then hopefully produce enough biomass on there that you could graze them later in the year, later in September and early October.
Okay, and so there's a couple of questions to follow up on that. So what would be a good high fiber feed to go along with some Brassica grazing?
Well, a lot of people will seed an oat crop with that. Okay, and those oats would be relatively tall by the time you went to go graze those. So if you seeded that oat and Brassica crop in July, late July, by the time you started grazing that in early September here in the Northeast, the oats would be relatively tall and contain a fair amount of fiber as well. You could potentially seed some grass species with that as well, or the other option is to actually feed them some fibrous material in the barn and then turn them out onto the Brassicas and just limit the amount that they can consume.
And does grazing Brassicas taint the milk at all?
It's a good question. I haven't seen much of that. Some of that might be related to when you graze them, how quickly you graze them, before milking or after milking, but I haven't seen much of that been an issue for us in the Northeast.
Okay. And it says, where can I get a copy of the chart that showed the different Brassicas? Is that posted anywhere else? I mean, it will be included in the recording of the webinar, but...
Yeah, it's Steve Herbert's data from University of Massachusetts, and I'm not sure where he might have that posted, but Steve Herbert was the researcher, and he would be the one to contact for that slide. I got that from him.
Okay. They do have a mass grass, isn't it called mass grass, their website?
Yes,
so you might
exactly.
Want to check that out.
Yeah.
And just back to the one person says, FYI, the moose came and ate all my turnips this year, so they like them.
I've had my wheat crop devastated by deer, so I can be commiserate with that person as well.
Okay, so in relation to trying to balance the rate of digestion of forage and fermentation of grain and making sure they are relatively the same, what rate of passage would be best?
Not sure I can answer that question exactly. What you're trying to do is match up the type of proteins you have in the diet with the type of energy sources. So if you look at, normally we look at protein being the most expensive supplementation cost. And so if you look at the kinetics or the digestibility of the protein and what happens when it hits the rumen, whether you have a lot of soluble or undegradable protein that's rapidly available, then you're going to have to feed a highly fermentable carbohydrate to match up with that. And the object there would be to feed more frequently as well, because you're going to have a high rate of passage through the animal's rumen of that situation. So it's one of those situations where feeding frequency also comes into play, as well as the types of feeds going in. So we're looking at normally a holding time in the animal's rumen of about 36 hours. And if you have high quality feed and a rapidly digestible carbohydrate system, then you're probably reducing that length of time it stays in the cow's rumen, which allows for higher intake potential. So I'm not sure if that answers the question, but I hope it did.
Okay, and then this is maybe a comment. Important to realize that across the board, grain does not yield more than 2 pounds of milk without good or high quality forages. Nutritionists from research would say more like 1.5, and below those results not worth feeding that extra pound of grain. Just a comment in terms of watching your grain consumption. Okay. This question comes from Central Coast of California, where they dairy out there, where the summer temperatures rarely exceed 75 and winters are mild. I'm currently flood irrigating my pastures with a blended well water / manure water, and I've planted annual perennial ryegrass. Any comments or problems to watch out for in terms of nutrition? No toast guy, but
yeah, I really like perennial ryegrass as a grazing crop. I think it does really well. There is some anti-feeding properties associated with perennial ryegrass, but I would not think of those as being a hindrance to using them as a forage crop, both as a conserved forage crop as well as a pasture crop. So. Perennial ryegrass is a nice lush grass. It produces a lot of vegetative material and not much stem or fibrous material. So you might want to make sure that they do have adequate fiber in the diet. If it's really lush, annual and perennial ryegrass, it may be actually too lush for them, and they may need some supplemental fiber.
Okay, this question is, what's a good planting density for grazing wheat or oats compared to planting for a grain crop?
That's a good question. I would say that for most of the grazing crops, you're going to be planting, at a higher density than you would for a grain crop. So if you're going to be grazing them for forage, I'd be planting them at probably 2 bushels to the acre, or maybe even 2.5 bushels to the acre. So a little bit higher. Some of it depends on how you seed it. If you're going to drill it, that's the most effective way to get that seed in the ground. If you're going to broadcast it and just harrow it in, you might want to up that seeding rate a little bit to get a good effective stand.
Okay, great, thanks. Any other questions for Rick? I think we've answered everything in the queue so far. Oh, here we go. Okay, don't you have to be aware of some perennial ryegrass that have endophyte in the species?
We have not had that issue in the Northeast at all. So if there are some regional people that have that problem, I'm not aware of that here in the Northeast. So,
okay.
Daryl Emick is one of the better grazing experts in the Northeast. He worked for NRCS for a number of years, and he did not like perennial ryegrass because of some of those issues. But and he was in New York, but here in Maine, we've never had any issues with that. So I think some of that's regional, and there may be some issues associated with it.
Okay. How do you deal with horse nettle?
I'm not quite sure how best to answer that question. I guess I would have to look at the situation, look what else is growing around there, and think about whether what type of clipping regime goes associated with that. How are you going to manage other weeds in that pasture as well, whether reseeding is an appropriate time period for that or what. But I'm not the expert on weed control in pastures necessarily, so.
But it sounds like a good sounds like a good topic for a future webinar.
Yep, it does.
Does soil pH affect my cow's rumen?
Soil pH probably in itself does not affect the cow's rumen all that much. I mean, the soil pH is going to impact the quantity and quality of the forage coming off of that. So making sure that the pH is adequate is going to impact how well the grasses and forages are going to be able to utilize soil nutrients. And obviously when we always talk about soil pH, we always seem to correlate that with the amount of calcium in the soil as well. So if the soil pH is relatively high, in most situations the calcium level in that soil is relatively high as well, which would impact the quality of, or the amount of calcium in the forage, which is another important factor in determining quality. So we like to see quality. We like to see calcium levels high in our forages as a great way to supplement that calcium in the cow's diet.
Okay, is it possible to feed 21% protein baleage with just corn pellets and not have the cows be loose?
I would say yes. You know, that if you're going to be feeding that corn, I would try and make sure that you try and find a way to get that corn to be most rapidly digestible, because obviously that crude protein, that baleage, would contain a fair amount of soluble protein as well as degradable protein. That's a high quality forage, but that corn is slowly digestible. So the key there is to finely grind that corn, if you potentially could, as fine as possible. Some other options might be to look at some other grains if you could. Barley, which is more rapidly digestible, would help with that. One of the things we did with some really high quality alfalfa is we used a tempering process on a grain where we actually tempered the grain. You might be able to temper corn as well as temper barley, and that involves soaking the grain or getting the grain moist and holding it for a 24 to 48 hour period. And what that does is it induces the germination of the grain, and then you process it. You can roll it after that, and that increases the kinetic value or the rate of digestion of that grain, and so it would match up more quickly with the soluble and degradable protein of that high quality baleage. So if you could process that grain a different way, that might help.
Okay, back to the endophyte in the perennial ryegrass. It says, this person says, my comments are coming from Illinois, I believe, and we used to have to be careful of endophyte in perennial ryegrass. So
Okay.
I noticed there are some participants that are from that area, so if you want to chime in, feel free, if that's been an issue in your neck of the woods as well. Okay, so next question, what maximum levels of soluble protein do you think are good for dry cows and then for milking cows?
Well, dry cows' requirements for protein are relatively low, so I wouldn't worry too much about the amount of soluble protein in a dry cow's ration as much as I would the amount of soluble protein in fresh cow and lactating cows. But for the total ration, what we normally look at, the amount of soluble protein in a dairy cow ration, that would be the forage and the grain combined, would be about 30% soluble protein in a total ration.
Okay. Do you feel that phytic acid is a factor in cattle nutrition? Am I pronouncing that right? P-H-Y-T-I-C, phytic acid?
I don't have a good answer for that.
Okay. Any other questions for Rick? I'm not seeing any. Oh. Okay. Just a few thank yous, Rick.
Great.
I will add my thank you to the list. So if you do feel like you have any other questions, there's that the www.eextension.org/ask. You can just click on there and ask your question. And as I said before, this webinar is part of an ongoing series regarding the access to pasture rule and grazing management in general. So we will be offering additional webinars after the first of the new year, so be looking on our website at www.eextension.org/organic_production. So you can find the archive of today's session, recordings of our other webinars, as well as several articles, videos, and more at that site. So thank you all for coming. Rick, thank you so much for your presentation. I really appreciate it. And
Thank you, Deb.
Yeah, and happy Thanksgiving to everybody.